So I was at Lowe's yesterday, or maybe it was the day before. I was looking for an impact drive special drill to help me change the blades on my mower more easily. Anyway, as I'm looking in the drill section, and I'm kind of like finding sort of what I need, but not quite, and I'm trying to kind of figure it out. And it was really frustrating because okay, normally I'm the type of person I don't want people to come up and say, "Hey, can I help you, sir?" at a store. I just want to go look, whatever. If I need you, I'll ask you. So I always, when Lowe's and Home Depot, they first came on the scene, you'd go in there and someone was always like, "Can I help you? Can I help you?" And I'm like, "No, no, no, just leave me alone. Let me look." Well, lately, in the last couple of years, it seems like it's the opposite. You can't get anybody. So I'm in this section for like 20, 30 minutes. And I'm kind of trying to figure stuff out. I'm pulling up my phone to try to figure stuff out because I'm trying to decide, like, do I need a 1/4 inch drive, a 1/2 inch drive? Is brushless? There's all these options, whatever. I'm comparing prices. Does it matter which brand it is? And not only that, but what was on display was not the same as what they actually had for sale in boxes. And they had the things in boxes locked, like padlocked behind like a metal grid, which I've never seen before. Like, I don't know, are people stealing drills all of a sudden? I've never seen that before in anywhere that I've lived. Well, maybe Washington, D.C., but we're not in a big city here. So that was kind of frustrating. So I couldn't get out the boxes and see what they had. There was also shortages, like they didn't have the batteries for the drills. They didn't, like, anyway, I finally get a guy to come over and I ask him a couple questions. He didn't know anything about drills or power tools. Like I knew more than him. And I'm like, okay, so an impact drive, do I need this? And he's like, "Oh, here's a drill. How about this one?" And I'm like, "Well, that's not an impact drive." Anyway, he didn't know anything. And I thought, after that experience, I thought, man, it feels like tacit knowledge is like gone, or just, you know, localized expertise where, you go to a hardware store and you find a guy in the tool aisle and he just knows a lot more about tools than you do. That's why he's working there, right? And I don't want to fall into the things used to be better, everything's getting worse mentality. Some things are definitely getting worse in the last 2 years since the government decided to just go full on national socialist since since early 2020. A lot of things have gotten worse, and I'm not going to deny that. But I was trying to put in perspectives, like, okay, why is there this apparent loss of tacit knowledge, or employees at a place like Lowe's or Home Depot don't seem to know anything about what they're doing anymore. Very few, anyway. And it used to be a lot more common. And I thought, well, there's a couple reasons. I mean, one, they don't need to. I mean, I was pulling up stuff on my phone and looking there anyway, and they can do the same. So you're always a quick internet search away from many of the types of questions you used to have to keep in your head. So you don't need to know all that stuff. And I also thought, you always got to ask the question, compared to what? So like, "Oh, this is really frustrating. Nobody here can help me. They don't know very much." Well, compared to what? Compared to a world before Lowe's and Home Depot and the large box stores existed, yes, your local hardware store would have some really grumpy guy who knew everything about tools. And if you didn't know anything about tools, it was kind of intimidating because they didn't speak your language. Their inventory was very low. It would take them a long time to get in anything if you wanted to order it. The prices were very high. There was like one in town. It usually wasn't very convenient to get to, and it had very limited hours. Like, that was the reality. That was what a hardware store was for the most part. So now all this stuff is plentiful, tons of varieties, always in stock until the last year or two. A lot of variety, much lower prices, great hours, convenient, all this stuff. So it's like, you can't got to compare apples to apples. You can't compare the guy at the little local, Tim's Hardware from yesteryear to employee number 85 at Lowe's. And again, the information accessibility, right? Like there wasn't any other way once upon a time to know something about which tool was right for the job without asking a human person who had done a lot of work with those tools and knew. You couldn't look it up anywhere. I mean, there weren't even books that were like, "Oh, let me just go look up what's better, an impact wrench or an impact drive for this tool," right? Like, or driver, but I don't even know the names of these things properly. So, that's changed. And I think that is important, but it's interesting because I thought, well, there was this sort of like golden transitional phase where the big box stores came about, all this convenience and lower prices and all this other stuff that I mentioned before, much more inviting, friendly, et cetera, to normies. And the people who worked there knew a decent bit about this department they worked in, the section they worked in. They worked in the paint department. They knew a lot about paint. If they worked in the tools, they worked in that used to be the case. And I think those people have either aged out or moved up to other roles or what, but now it's very, very rare that someone at a store knows a lot at like just a mainstream, maybe if it's like a high-end store, knows much about the products. Anyway, this is a huge setup for what the main topic that I'm talking about here. And it's almost just barely connected, but it got me thinking. It made the connection in my head. So I was thinking about firing employees. Like, okay, so if somebody's really like just slack, they don't know much about stuff, and when do you fire them? Of course, market conditions have a big part to play, because if you can't find anybody better to replace them with, even if they're not creating very much value, you may have to keep them. They may be better than the next best alternative. But the ethics of firing someone, and this is what connects to the main topic at hand. Is it wrong for a business person to fire employees, just because they're not maximizing profit? Now, of course, from an economic, political, sort of general ethical standpoint, I think it's incredibly easy to argue that that's not wrong. That's just business. But the reason I asked the question is because I was listening to a podcast by Jonathan Pageau, who I really enjoy. He has a podcast called The Symbolic World. And I always wait till they come out on podcast. I hate consuming things on YouTube. I just prefer being able to, take a walk and listen to a podcast. So I listen to him on there, but he's a Orthodox icon carver who has a very, very interesting, and I would say enlightening perspective, understanding of the world on like a very high level, of symbols, what they mean, how they represent the structure of reality as conveyed through ancient Christianity, which is, sort of still practiced in the Orthodox Church in a way that's much more layered and rich with rituals and symbols than certainly in the Protestant Church. And so it felt like I've really enjoyed him in the last year or two, especially because there's really not any non-symbolic, non-mythical, non-religious way to make sense of the world that we live in now. 3, 4, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, yeah, you could get away with some pretty thin sort of materialist worldviews. You can't now. There's just too much weird stuff happening that can't be explained unless you understand these deeper patterns of what's going on in the unseen realm. And so I've really enjoyed his podcast. I think it's fascinating. I think he's a really, really, really deep thinker, and I've gained a ton from it. But he said something in a recent episode. It was about, is Christianity revolutionary? Well, he did 2 episodes. The first was Christianity is not revolutionary. And he kind of laid out the reasons why, that it's not about, going and finding whoever's in power and throwing them out of power and taking their stuff and, redistributing it or whatever, a violent revolt, trying to tear down the existing structures, and sort of explained, how Christianity is more of a return to the proper ordering of things, to the structures, hierarchies in nature, in creation that created by God, that are there, sort of divinely, that what a non-religious person who believes in, objectivity of some kind might call just a natural law or whatever. That it's about restoring that, getting it to its proper alignment, having proper relationships between the highest and the lowest and everything between, not just the low overthrowing the high, or not the opposite of that, the high oppressing the low. And so the part 2 was like a response to people who were critical of that. Now, I didn't see the critiques of this. I can imagine them, right? I can imagine sort of the social gospel, social justice, like, no, Jesus was a revolutionary. He was like a hippie who wanted everybody to live in a commune and what, you know what I mean? not the hippie commune part, but I absolutely identify with, I'm drawn to, I resonate with a kind of rebellious, revolutionary sort of ethos. Like in all the stories, I always resonate with the kind of the rebel, right? The Han Solo character, who's not working against the structure, but who's not like an insider. He's not part of it. He's kind of a rebel, right? And I like that appeals to me. So I get that. So Pageau was sort of, addressing sort of balancing out the previous episode about how Christianity is not revolutionary, and making clear that it's also not about like maintaining some, it's not just about maintaining the status quo just because, right? Because the status quo is often oppressive. The hierarchical structure, those on top are often oppressive to others, et cetera. And so he was kind of talking more about like, what is the relationship between the low and the high, whether it be in poverty or in other senses. I always hate it when it's restricted only to material wealth. Like, the low are people who don't have a lot of money, and the high are people who have a lot of money. I think that's kind of weirdly idolatrous of material possession, but that's not what I think Pageau meant. Anyway, as he's sort of going through and talking about this, he made a couple offhand comments. Now, these can be completely, it's possible that he and I don't disagree at all, and it's only a difference in definition and words that are used. That's possible. But the way that I use certain words and definitions, he said a few things that I just don't feel were quite accurate or a little too loose. So he said, and again, this is not like a call out video at all. This is just me processing the way that I think about these things, because it's always useful when you hear another perspective. He said that Christianity is not laissez-faire capitalism, or does not lead to laissez-faire capitalism. And then a second thing he said was that Christianity is not a system where, like in laissez-faire capitalism, a businessman, if his employee just isn't producing profit, he just fires them if they're not profitable, right? That there are other considerations, and that he has a duty to them, a moral duty in different ways that goes beyond just making sure the business is healthy. And again, there's a very charitable way I could interpret both of those statements, in which I could find them not in contradiction with Christianity, or where I could agree with them. But the interpretation, the way that I define most of those things, I do find some conflict or some disagreement. So let's start with the first one, that Christianity doesn't lead to laissez-faire capitalism. I think it's the only thing that it can lead to, period. Genuine Christianity. Because capitalism, as I define it, it's simply private ownership, private property, which means eventually some individual owns, individuals own everything that's out there, including what we call the means of production, businesses, machinery, whatever. And they pay people to work it. There's details in the system, but those are all emergent. And so private ownership of the means of production, but everything, private property and freedom to trade. Those are not, capitalism is not a laissez-faire capitalism, which means minimal, in my ideal view, zero government intervention. That's not a positive system. It's not it's not created by a policy. It's not created by a government. It's not enforced by anything. Laissez-faire capitalism is an emergent order. It is an emergent system. It's dynamic and changing, but it's emergent when one condition is met, when violence is not initiated. That's it. When no one is forced to do anything in particular by a government at the point of a gun. Now, they may have duties, obligations, contractual agreements with each other, etc. But it's what emerges. It's what emerges. You have to initiate violence to prevent it from emerging, period. You must. It will emerge always and everywhere, because the nature of property, for example, the nature of exchange, the nature of production and savings, and these things And then it gets more and more complex as people engage with each other, but it is a negative system. It's merely the absence of the use of violence in economic exchanges or in anything. So Christianity is not a religion of initiating violence. I think violence in self-defense is permissible in Christianity, although not even always preferable. I mean, Jesus and the disciples all chose martyrdom instead of self-defense. I think they could have been morally justified to use violence to defend themselves, but they found that to be less preferable than not resisting at all and choosing martyrdom, right? That's how radical Christianity is when it comes to violence. I mean, when the rich man came to Jesus and said, "What should I do to be saved?" Jesus was speaking to his heart. He wasn't saying, to be saved, you got to change the outcomes for the poor. Otherwise, you can't be saved unless they get rich. He understood that there was something in that man's heart he needed to do. So he said, give your possessions to the poor, sell all your possessions, give them to the poor. Then what happened? Scripture tells us the man walked away, dejected. He walked away. Did Jesus say, Peter, John, get your swords, chase him down, hold him up, tell him, give your stuff away, or we'll throw you in a cage, and if you resist, we'll kill you? No, but that's what government does. That's what government is. It is the only thing government is, the one and only distinguishing feature that makes government different from any other institution, a business, a church, a charity, whatever, is it claims a monopoly. It claims that it can legitimately initiate violence. It can tell you, give us your money or we will murder you. Obey this policy or we will murder you. And people say, well, it's not murder. They just issue fines and whatever. Don't pay the fines. Then what happens? They come to your house, try to take you away. Say, I'm not going to let you take me away. I haven't done anything wrong. Eventually, murder. Violence is always the thing at back of every law, every policy. Always. It is the single, that is what government is. It is the use of violence. If you say, oh man, I really support green initiatives. Well, what does that mean? You support trying to convince people peacefully to purchase products that you think are green or to change their lifestyle in a way that you think are green or whatever? Or does it mean passing a law? If it means passing a law, it means the use of violence. And you cannot delegate rights that you yourself don't have. If you feel it's morally wrong to walk to your next door neighbor, to put a gun to their head and say, start recycling or I'm going to kill you. Does that sound Christ-like to you? If it does not, then lobbying for, advocating for, supporting a law, the government says you must now recycle or else pay a fine or else get a whatever. You can't. It's not, you don't have that moral right. That's the use of violence. That's what it is. It's not peaceful persuasion. It's violence. So anything that requires the initiation of violence, not self-defense, is in contradiction to the law of God, to Christianity, which means any restriction on market exchanges, minimum wage laws, anything, things that have good intentions, things that you believe produce good outcomes. I can spend all day, years, explaining to you how interventions don't produce good outcomes. They always make things worse than allowing people to find equilibrium. But even if you believe that, it doesn't matter. You are not called to use the tools of the kingdom, to use the tools of violence to force people to do what you think is right. So yeah, Christianity, the absence of the initiation of violence in bringing about the ends that we desire as Christians, it does result in laissez-faire capitalism. Absolutely. Now, does that mean laissez-faire capitalism, again, it's a negative system. It's what emerges. It's people being free in the marketplace. Does it make them more moral? Well, no, it doesn't make them more moral. Now, I've written an entire short book on the morality of capitalism, and I argue that compared to any other system, again, you always have to ask compared to what? Compared to any other system, which every single alternative uses violence, people have a better opportunity to become more moral under capitalism. And the incentive structure over the long term, it tends to align moral behavior, at least outwardly moral behavior, with profit in the long term. Again, you can do a lot of cheating and whatever, but you can do that in any system. The fact that it prohibits monopolies, right? If you're talking of a negative system with no violence, you can't say you must buy my product or I'll kill you, like governments can say. It forces competition, which forces people to understand how to treat people well, how to treat customers well. But it's not itself, it's not salvation, right? You don't worship at the feet of the market or the profit motive or whatever. I think they're incredible things. I think they are a reflection of the genius of creation, that people pursuing their own means of survival and their own self-interest, even wicked people. What does Christ say? What was meant for wicked is turned for good, right? That's a integral part of the Christian story. Things meant for evil are often turned for good. That's the market at a large scale. Like even selfish jerks trying to, make money off of you, whatever. If they are not granted any kind of government protection or monopoly or regulatory barriers that keep their competition out, there's really only one way to do that in the long term. They can rip you off in the short term, but in the long term, it's to create value for you. And what maybe they intended for evil. So, I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible how it works. I can tell it. I think it's actually a testament. It gives me chills. It gives me chills when I observe the workings of the market, like in Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and the interconnectedness of all these strangers working for their own interests, creating this incredible network. Anyway, but that's not the point. The point is, it's not you must advocate for free market capitalism and you must put on a hat or something, put on a monocle. I don't know what the outfit is. No, it's not about being cheerleader. It's just don't initiate violence and don't advocate the initiation of violence. And when you do that, there is nothing but laissez-faire capitalism that can emerge. Now, the second part is a little more interesting. This is unprofessional to drink my coffee but I never said I was professional. The second part about, in the Christian worldview, you don't just fire an employee if they're not performing. Now, I think that's very interesting because it may be true, but I don't think it is true by necessity in any way. You may know that to serve Christ means you've got some employee and they are far inferior to what you could get for what you're paying them if you went and found somebody else on the market. And maybe they're causing your business to lose money. You may feel that to serve Christ correctly, you may feel very strongly, for whatever reason, maybe if I fire this person, they'll be out on the street, or, they'll whatever. Maybe they have a criminal record and no one else will hire them and they'll go back to crime. And you feel like it is my duty to keep this person on, even if I take a loss. That absolutely can happen. And that's absolutely something that a Christian needs to be aware of. But I don't think you can say that the idea of firing an employee who is not creating value in and of itself is not Christian. In fact, I think that is a very, very subtly dangerous idea. Because what is a business? A business is a group of people who have come together under some contractual terms with a goal. And the goal ultimately is to create value. Now, the creation of value in the economic sense is subjective. It's based on what people, how valuable is a gallon of water? It depends. Are you in the desert about to die, or are you in a swimming pool? Well, I don't know if you want to drink the swimming pool water, but you get my point. So economic value is subjective. It's not the same as moral value or ontological value in some sense. It's how much people value things. The creation of value happens when someone or someones, they take a resource that is valued at a certain level on the market relative to other resources, relative to the time cost, which can be expressed in money and other terms to obtain that resource. It's valued at a certain amount. They take it, they do something with it, and then they go and sell it. And the amount they sell it for is higher than the original price and the cost of what they did to it. It's called a profit. Profit is nothing other than a signal that value was created. Because let's say there's a pile of potatoes that a bunch of potatoes in the ground, and I dig them up. I could sell those potatoes to somebody, let's say for $10. That's the price I can find on the market. So that's what, the next person, whatever it is, whoever I can find, that's what they're valued at. And the more extensive markets get, the better and more accurate those signals of value get, and they adapt and they adjust and they're all flexible. But at a given time, let's say I can sell them for $10. Let's say I take those potatoes, I cut them up, I wash them off, throw them on a tray, put some salt on them, throw them in the oven, and I make French fries. Let's say that took me an hour of my time. And let's say I value an hour of my time because the next best thing I could do with that hour, somebody would pay me $20 for. So that's $20 plus the $10 I could have gotten from the potatoes on the market, $30. Now I take this big giant batch of fries, I go put them in little things and sell them for $5 a piece. And people voluntarily pay me $5 for this, which means they express through their action, they value what they obtain more than the $5 they gave up to get it. That's how economic value works. They wouldn't have done it otherwise. So value was created for them. They started with $5. They ended up with something that was valued more than $5 by them. Let's say after I sell them all, I earn $40 total. Now I can see the $40 I earned is evidence. It's an indication that profit, because I spent $30, $20 for an hour of my time that I could have, with my opportunity cost, $10 for the raw resource. Maybe the salt was a few pennies. The electricity in the oven. The profit I made, that $10, that is a signal that I created $10 worth at least of value that didn't previously exist. My time had a value already that I could sell for $20, which means somebody valued it at that amount, which means it was going to create that much value for them above the next best alternative. The potatoes were valued in the market by $10. But that additional $10, that was newly created value. I created that. And it was value that other people obtained. And the profit is my indication of the value I created for them. It's a measuring stick. So I have just expanded the overall wealth of the world by taking a resource, mixing it with another resource, doing something with it, and finding a market who valued it more than the inputs. Now, conversely, let's say I could only sell those for $2 each and I lost money. I sold $20 worth, but I put in $20 of my time and $10. In that case, I have actually destroyed value. I took those potatoes, let's simplify it a little bit. Let's just say I took the potatoes, did something to it, forget my labor inputs. They were valued at $10 and then I sold them as fries and made $8. I destroyed value. I took a resource that was valued at one thing on the market. I did something to it and made it less valuable on the market. And again, the market is just the aggregate of individual people's subjective values, but I have destroyed value. Now, if you continue to destroy value, you reduce the value for everyone in the world and you reduce the quality of life. You reduce prosperity, opportunity, all the things that come with increased value creation, with increased wealth, health, less poverty, less suffering, all these sort of, material things, granted. And I'm not idolizing those. Those are less important than spiritual things. But they're connected too. You don't just reject the material things and say that they're bad. They're not. They're redeemed as well. That's why Christianity is so much bolder and braver than, say, Gnosticism. That's value destruction. And there really isn't a neutral. You're either creating value or destroying value. I mean, you can, take things and just never make a profit, always break even exactly. But that's more of an accounting concept. Ultimately, things fluctuate all the time. You're either creating value or you're destroying value. You can push value around, but that usually ends up in the destruction of value, because if you push it around, there's a cost to pushing it around and you don't know the alternative. So you always want to be looking for how you can create value. That's how you survive as an individual in the market, because you need food, you need water, you need shelter. But I'd also argue that's how you're wired. That's how you're built. That's how you're created. Fill the earth, subdue it, right? Co-creators. You are expanding, prospering, growing. And I'm not saying there's like prosperity gospel, like, oh, you got to get rich or you're not a Christian. Not at all. Nothing like that. But any act you engage in, ideally, you don't want to destroy value. You don't want to take something and make it worth less to all the humans around you than it was before you did something with it. Just as a general rule. Again, if you do it, it basically is a death cult. If every business lost money every year, it would be a death spiral. And a culture that worships that says operating at a loss is moral and operating at a profit is bad, that's basically a death cult. It's basically saying humans ought to destroy value. They ought to destroy their own substance, their own means to survive. That's the only good is if you're destroying value. And I don't think you should worship profit or the creation of value and say the only good is if you're materially progressing either. But I think it's far more in line with what Christians are called to be in the realm of business, in the market, to create value, of course. So that brings me to the employee. If you have an employee that you're paying to perform something with your business, and they are making your business less profitable than if you had a different alternative employee you could replace them with, you're creating less value for the world than you could. And the goal of your business is to create value for the world. And for the world, that includes you, right? I mean, it's up to you how much of that value you want to take in the form of pay or, in the form of profit or dividends or however you want to do that. But if an employee is either destroying value, like actively costing you more money than they create in value, or producing less value than you could get from someone else, as a business with the value creation as the goal, I think it's one completely within the Christian ethic to say, I've got to let that person go. This contract where I've told you, you can work here under the following conditions if you're creating the following value. And if you're not, I'm going to find somebody else who can. That's the way we all operate, right? Like nobody does, like the distinction between consumer and producer, or business person and customer, or employee and owner, those distinctions are often dramatically exaggerated, because when you think about all economic activity, it's all an exchange, and both parties to the exchange, you can give them different labels, but they're two individuals. I have something that you want. I have something that you want. Let's trade. That's all it ever is, right? So think of how you operate when you engage in exchange. If you were to say that it is wrong to fire an employee who's not creating enough value or who's destroying value, then you must also say it is wrong for you to buy a product just because it's better than a competing product. It would be like saying you have a duty to buy the worst products on the market so that those companies don't go out of business. You have a duty to buy products that make your life worse, that destroy value for you. Again, if that's a duty, then that's a death cult. That's a death cult. That's worshiping of suffering, and it's a hatred of humanity in a way, in a really sinister way. And I think most of the environmental movement, frankly, is completely Most people are just well-meaning. Oh, I just like trees and water, and it looks gross when I see a, dirty cup in one. That's yucky. We should take care of the earth. But what's behind some of the most sort of radical, the people pushing a lot of this stuff, besides just rent seeking, just using it to get government subsidies and stuff like that, which is the vast majority of the economic activity in the so-called green movement. But those who are deeply ideologically, philosophically concerned, it's an anti-life, anti-human cult, kind of a death cult. It's basically like every unit of human prosperity, of human success, every time a human feels good or achieves something or lives well, part of Earth dies. And the solution is for humans to suffer so that Earth may live. It's this zero-sum idea, and that humans are always the part of the equation that's got to go, right? Have fewer kids, consume fewer things. It's like the more you suffer, oh, well, I drive a really crappy, tiny little car because it's green, and I donate money to carbon offsets, which, they're all squandered away. I mean, all the green technology, don't get me started on the economics of it. All of it, pretty much without exception, consumes more resources in its production than it can produce. It literally destroys value. Solar panels, windmills. Again, here's an easy tell. If it requires a government subsidy, which is putting a gun at your neighbor's head and saying, I will murder you if you don't give me your money, and then taking that money and saying, only with this money that we've taken from people against their will is this industry able to survive, only with this subsidy, that's a surefire sign that industry, that product, is destroying value, because they're taking something, whatever's needed to create the windmill, all the raw materials and whatever, that are valued in the market at X. They're mixing it with some labor valued at a certain thing, and then they're selling it. And what they sell it for is less than what it costs to put in. So they have to get money that was stolen from people at gunpoint, at the threat of murder, in order to make up the difference. That's almost all green technology. And when you start to understand, that's a death cult. It's a spiral of, talk about sustainable. It is utterly unsustainable. Eventually you run out of other people's money, right? Like, if you're not creating value, you're taking value from people to subsidize the destruction of value. You're rewarding the destruction of value with subsidies taken away from people who actually created value. You think about how twisted that is. That's what's going on in that scenario. So that's why I would say, obviously, on an individual basis, and employers are not calculating machines. They are not homo economicus who just are operating in this market equilibrium vacuum ever. I mean, run a business. I've run several, or get in to work with a business owner. I've done this several times. It's so inefficient and discombobulated. It's this constant search. It's this chaos, right? When you get to the individual level, it always looks like chaos. Yet in the aggregate, if markets are left free, it's incredible the harmony that comes about. Go read Bastiat. Hey, if you like Pageau, French last name, Jonathan Pageau, Frederick Bastiat, French guy. He's awesome, phenomenal. Go read That Which Is Seen, That Which Is Unseen, or Economic Harmonies, or Economic Sophisms. But on the individual level, right, it's chaotic. So not only employers are like, they're not able to calculate in some precise way, this person is destroying N units of value, I must replace them with someone who, creates Y units of value, whatever. It's not like that. But there's a huge grace period, because hiring and firing sucks. It sucks to fire someone. It feels bad. The first time I ever fired someone, I couldn't sleep for like a week. I just felt bad, it's not a fun feeling. And it's really challenging to a business. A lot of friction, a lot of time. It's often like, just leave them on. So there's this huge grace room already, this huge space where it's like, I'm not calculating it down to the penny, but okay, we need to replace this person with someone. This person is, all the other employees are basically paying for their problems by having to make up for it, whatever. It's not fair to them. It's not fair to my customers. They're suffering, and it's not fair to the world. I'm destroying value or creating less than I could. So to say that that's wrong across the board, that Christianity is not a system where you fire people who don't create value, I think that's crazy, because the alternative is a death call. However, again, on the individual level, business owners, they make these decisions all the time. Maybe it's somebody they used to be great. Now they're really old and they're not very useful anymore, but like they keep up the morale of the team. You like having them around. There's all kinds of reasons, just purely business reasons that people do this all the time that keep inferior employees on. But then as a Christian, the moral reason, you're not obligated to only create as much value as you possibly can and ruthlessly, you're not obligated to do that. It depends. What do you feel you serving God in that moment, in that time? What does that look like? And sometimes it's firing the employee and sometimes it's not. I feel like there was one other thing I wanted to touch on, but maybe not. Maybe I wrapped it up. Anyway, I just, again, I love Pageau. And, it's not because he's a Canadian and he's French that I'm, biased, assuming that he must be a socialist or something. Jonathan Pageau, I don't think he's a socialist. I don't think he cares too much about political ideology, and nor do I. But it was kind of like an offhanded comment, like, oh, it's not this laissez-faire capitalism. Now, I get it. Laissez-faire capitalism. If someone were to call the United States economy today laissez-faire capitalism, I would understand every bit of hatred. It's national socialism. I mean, it's a complete cronyist, like it's insane. Go industry by industry. Pharmaceutical, almost zero free market, 100% protected from liability of common law, whatever. Subsidies up the wazoo, regulations that keep out competitors. All of the people who run the major corporations are on the boards of all the regulatory bodies that regulate them. There's graft. There's, financial industry. Don't get me started, right? Like retail is probably the most free market. Although some of the areas around transportation and shipping and logistics that feed retail are increasingly controlled and, it's a bunch of oligarchy and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so I get it. And it's not one of those, well, free markets have never been tried. Like it's a continuum, right? The freer the market, the better, right? First of all, the more moral, the less violence that's employed to force people to do things, the better. And the more people have a scope to develop morality because they have a free choice and they don't have a gun to their head all the time. But the outcomes are better as well. Oh, okay. That was the last thing I want to talk about. I'll get there in a second. So it's a continuum, right? So like to the extent that there is free markets or capitalism, to the extent that it exists in the US, that's a good thing. And that's not antithetical to Christianity. In fact, again, it's what results when you employ Christian morality in the world. To the extent that it doesn't exist, it's a bad thing, right? And there's always interventions, there's always interruptions, and criminal activity, and some of those criminals form into very large groups and call themselves governments, right? St. Augustine was dead right about that. That governments are nothing but highwaymen, except for they tell you they're doing it for your own good, which is more offensive. Not governance, not hierarchy, not leadership, not structure, not even law and norms and contracts and protection for those contracts. And I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about a monopoly on the initiation of force that says, I'm going to be the one that registers your title, whether you want me to or not. And if you don't pay me, I'll murder you. I'm providing this service for you and I'll kill you if you don't buy it. Right? That's different from, again, I've spent most of my life studying these things. I could give you all kinds of articles and things on, and if you've listened to this podcast before, you're very familiar with the difference between order and government, or governance and government. So this is not a utopian reject all structures and hierarchies and whatever. No, not at all. In the absence of the initiation of violence. I mean, I think it's like Tolkien's, Tolkien was a anarchist. Tolstoy was an anarchist. And both of them were very much in favor of structures and leaders and order and laws, both natural and human and ecclesiastical, and these things. But they evolve and form and emerge and are refined through voluntary processes in the marketplace of ideas, norms, etc. Anyway, the final point I want to make on helping the poor. What does that mean? I've always found it interesting that the closer you would call an economy or a culture to free market capitalism, the more concern for the poor exists in that culture. I don't think I've ever seen an exception. Now, part of it could be because the closer, the more free a market, the more wealth it produces, and people are wealthier, and people can afford to care about the poor when they're wealthy because they're not worried about their own survival. It's hard to, to know the cause and effect, but I think there's a deep cultural thing there that's pretty interesting. Now, there's a question of what is a Christian's duty to the poor? What does that mean? Is it to solve poverty? I don't think it can be that for a couple of reasons. One, Jesus said the poor will always be with you. Two, probably the reason Jesus said that, because poverty is relative. Equality is impossible. Material equality between people is impossible. And it's not even desirable. Everybody's different. Everybody's made different. Some people are really good at things that are highly valued by others. Some people are really good at things that are only somewhat valued by others. That's not a moral value. That's just an economic value, right? An economic judgment. Like, oh, this just creates more value for me. You're really good at growing food that helps me live. You're really good at drawing pictures that are nice, but I don't need them to live. So this person commands more, ends up getting more resources through trade than this person. It's not a moral judgment. It's just people are different. So, the idea of ending poverty, you can't, because there's always someone who has less than someone else. So whatever, there's always a bottom quartile, right? There's always a bottom 10% in terms of whatever you choose to measure. It could be wealth, it could be happiness, it could be whatever you want to call it. People are different. So there's always going to be a bottom, which just means those on one end of the distribution. You can't solve that. It will never go away. It will just get redefined, and wherever the level is will change. I mean, what was considered poor in America 200 years ago was like, you're a couple meals away from death. What's considered poor in America today is you need to take like 20 meals off so you don't die of too much food, right? I'm not saying that to be glib. Like, I'm just expressing how different things, how you'll never get rid of poverty or the poor. So what does it mean to serve the poor? I think it means a couple things. I think it means, first and foremost, a mindset for the person doing the service. And it doesn't matter if that person is rich or poor. You can serve the poor and be poor. You can serve the poor and be rich. You can serve the poor and be middle class. It doesn't matter. I think it's a mindset. It's a reminder that whoever you deem to be poor, they're also a child of God. They're also a divine creation. And that's a really hard thing to do. And I think you can't just accept that mentally and say, oh, I accept that everyone's a child of God. But every time I walk by somebody who stinks and is poor and dirty, I act as if they're not a child of God, right? That's why it's an action. Serve the poor, right? Like whatever that looks like, give them money, be kind to them, smile at them, help them if you can. Don't walk away, It's about you understanding that every human is created in the image of God. And then I think it's, okay, what about the part that's not just for me, improving my mindset and being more Christ-like in the way that I see the world? What if it's really to change the outcome for them? To the extent that that's true, right? You don't have control of it. You can only control yourself, but you can do things to try to help others. I think that's right. There's two layers to that as well. Do you help the person on a fundamental spiritual level or on a material level? Well, I think both matter. And I think they're often interconnected, but in unsuspecting and in surprising ways sometimes. Obviously, I would argue that the spiritual level is more important because it's the root, right? Like, what is the cause? Why is this person suffering? Why are they in this dire condition? Why are they poor? It's usually not just because they don't have a $20 bill in their hand, or because they don't have a means to get a $20 bill in their hand every day. Now, those are a part, but there's usually something deeper. There's usually other struggles, brokenness, challenges, that come down to something much, much deeper. So I think understanding that first we're called to have the mindset just for ourselves to understand that everyone is a child of God and created in his image. And then if we want to help them, bring to bear the thing that we have as Christians that non-Christians don't, which is a spiritual understanding, which is an understanding of that the battle is not against flesh and blood. Whatever they're battling against goes deeper, right? Bring that to bear. And then finally, on the material plane, how to help a poor person on the material level. I think that's something that doesn't get a lot of scrutiny. Now, part of it's because if you're focused on having your mindset right and helping them in spirit, then okay, you give them money, maybe that doesn't solve their poverty, but it signals to them that you see them as a child of God, and maybe it helps heal some of their spiritual wounds and it establishes something there. Maybe you can pray with them. So it's not about solving the poverty, but to the extent that you do want to improve their material conditions, creating value in the marketplace is orders of magnitude more effective than giving people money, than charity. Doesn't mean you shouldn't give people money. But again, I'm saying if you were only to ask what helps alleviate poverty the most, it's the creation of value and opportunity. Because if I have a business, even if I don't employ any poor people directly, even if I don't sell products to any poor people directly, if I'm creating value, there is now more value in the world than there was before. And those who have that value have the ability to do more things, right? More with less, right? Achieve the same outcome with less input, which means prices come down, which means access to higher quality goods increases, which means opportunities go up, which means I can now expand my business and hire somebody in lower income brackets to do some other aspect that I just developed. I mean, look at every product, every major innovation that makes quality of life better in a somewhat market economy begins as a luxury good that's not sold to the poor, and it's usually not built by the poor. But it ends as something ubiquitous. Air conditioning, television, cars, cell phones. That's accessible and held by all, and it creates value for all, and it increases, reduces poverty, expands opportunity. So I think that's important to the extent that Christians are responsible for improving material conditions, to the extent that that is a part of a Christian's duty. It's not the thing to be idolized. It's not the only duty by any means, not at all. I think it's again, being Christ-like and helping others find truth, find freedom on a spiritual level. But again, what's great about Christianity, what makes it, as C.S. Lewis said, it's more manly, has a chest to it, is that it doesn't reject the material entirely. It doesn't idolatrize. Why can't I get idolize? Why couldn't I come up with idolize? My goodness, not good. It doesn't idolize the material, but it doesn't reject it and say that it's always evil, that it's always right. It's not money is the root of all evil. The love of money. Money is neutral. Money is a tool. Money is simply a representation of value. It's a representation of past value created. Or, well, we won't get into what inflation is, but that's pernicious. Anyway, but the love of money, right? To place money in the position, it's money is a tool. But Christians are not called to abandon all tools and float away in their light bodies into the spirit realm. They're called to use tools. They're called to live, to actually redeem the material world, to bring it back into alignment with the divine as it should be, to redeem what's fallen. Even, that's why Christ incarnated as a human. That's the whole idea of resurrection. The body resurrects. It's redeemed. It's not some dirty, horrible thing to be escaped from. It's to be redeemed. So to the extent that there is a material level of responsibility in Christians, I think value creation is what we ought to be thinking about. certainly not condemning. It doesn't mean you can't give money. It doesn't mean charity is bad, but acts that are considered charitable, like on the material level, very often, not only destroy economic value, but and they don't always, but very often create conditions for the poor that make escaping spiritual poverty harder. I mean, it's the classic spoiled kid thing. You got a spoiled, rotten kid and they just keep doing self-destructive things, and you just bail them out and fund their whole life and pay for their apartment, whether they're employed or not, and subsidize that, you are making it harder for them to ever escape that. You're creating a moral hazard, which is an economic term, but even though it has the word moral in it, but it's a moral term as well, right? Like, you're creating a moral hazard. You can't expect humans to have such incredible strength of will that you put them in a position where sinning, or not even sinning, just being trapped, being in spiritual bondage, having deep wounds, is rewarded, is subsidized, is protected, is coddled. You can't expect them to so easily break out of that. This is not like a tough love, like, well, stop giving the poor money and they'll figure out how to get a job, right? Like, it's not, I'm not making that point. Again, it's much more nuanced than that. And it comes down to an individual level. Because remember, society can't act. Abstractions and aggregates, collectives can't act. Only individuals can act. So think about this in the context of your own life as a Christian, if you are one. There are ways to feel good about helping the poor that aren't helping the poor, that are maybe even making it harder for them. And one of the primary ones is trying to help the poor through public policy. Again, we've already discussed the moral side of it. It's the initiation of violence. So it's wrong flat out. But let's just even push that aside. What happens when you say you offload, you outsource your duty to help the poor to a government policy? Oh, I really want a living wage because I'm a Christian and Christians care about the least of these. I'm sorry. That's lazy. Not only is it asking for the initiation of violence, someone to go to a business owner and say, I will murder you if you don't pay people this much money. Not only is it destroying value, because if you need to use force, it means that you are people who would otherwise do something at a certain level of value, at a certain exchange rate, will only raise it at the point of a gun. It means that raising it is destroying value relative to where it could be. But think about not only those moral aspects. On the practical side, what does it actually mean? If I want to hire, if some kid comes to me and says, hey, I have autism and I have a really hard time focusing on certain things or interacting socially. I can't really be one of your typical entry-level employees, but I really want to learn. I really want to get some experience. And maybe I pay a typical entry-level employee $40,000 a year. And they say, I know that I'm not going to be able to create that much value, and the pressure is going to be too much, and it's going to be hard on your business and your other employees if I'm at that level with them, and I'm suffering. But I want to learn, I want to improve, and I want to do what I can to start getting my career going. Can I work for you for $10 an hour? That may be a wonderful thing. And let's say I'm not a Christian. Let's say I'm a business owner who doesn't care. Let's say I'm a jerk and I don't care about this person personally at all. I'm purely thinking of my economic interest, which again, business owners really aren't that economically calculated. Let's say I'm purely thinking I've got my monocle. Even being as cold and callous as that, if I could say, okay, yeah, if they wash dishes for me in the back and they do whatever, I could afford $10 an hour. That would actually be worth it for me. And it's worth it for them. Now, if you come along being a good Christian saying, I'm demanding a living wage of $20 an hour because I care about the poor, that person will not have a job. They will get fired and they probably won't get hired anywhere else because they can't come close to creating $20 worth of value. And you're literally cutting off the least of these from opportunity, the true least of these. The percentage of people that make minimum wage in the United States, it's like 1% or something. So think about anyone below that. Those are the true least of these. The people who can't even get hired at minimum wage because it's not worth it. And you raise that minimum wage, you just keep raising that bar and making it harder and harder for those people. And again, we're talking about a small number of people. We're talking about edge cases. This is not, if you remove the minimum wage today, all businesses would not drop their wages, in fact, immediately. In fact, I doubt any of them would drop them at all. Maybe a few in a couple places. But there would suddenly be a handful of opportunities on the fringes for some of those people on the margins, as Pageau likes to talk about, who are priced out of the market by that minimum wage law. And now suddenly they can come and say, let me work for free because I want to learn. I don't know anything about work. And if it's illegal, you're literally pointing a gun at that person's head too, by the way. You're saying it's illegal for you to offer your services for less than this. You will go to prison. Or if you resist, we'll murder you. I'm not trying to be bombastic. You just need to understand fundamentally that is what policy is, what government-backed policy is. So for that person, say, I need to learn and no one will take me because I'm not very good. But can I come for free? Can I come for $5 an hour, $2 an hour? Can I come, right? Taking that away, again, ignore the moral component, the value destruction component. That's not a service to the least of these. It's an easy way to feel like you're doing something. You're doing something big because yes, I can go help one poor person, give them a little money, pay them to mow my lawn, whatever. Pray for them. But I want to help the poor in aggregate. And I can't do that on a big enough level. So I'm going to advocate government to do it because they can do it. They can steal money from get $1 billion and go help millions of people, whatever. And now you feel really good. But violence is used, values destroyed, and the target of that assistance is the most needy among them are almost always made worse off by those policies. So all that to say, Pageau, I love your stuff. And I'm going to keep listening. I really enjoy it. But to the extent that laissez-faire capitalism is, as I define it, simply a free market that emerges in the absence of violence and coercion, you would absolutely expect to see that in a Christian culture, in a Christian world. And to the extent that you are not violating some higher command that makes you feel like you ought to keep an employee on board, firing an employee who's not creating value is not at all antithetical to Christianity. Worshiping operating at a loss and denigrating operating at a profit is very susceptible to become an anti-human death cult. Again, worshiping profit is also very dangerous, right? I'm not making that point. And I'm not saying that material success has any equivalence to holiness. Oh, that person's rich, they must be holy. Oh, that person's poor, they must be, unholy. No, nothing like that at all. There is not an equivalence there. I mean, read Ecclesiastes, read Proverbs, right? You see all kinds of some evil men get rich, some good men suffer, Doesn't mean there's no causal relationships and it's all random. And I do think that wealth among Christians and as well as kind of like bleeding heart secular types is very misunderstood. And there's this assumption that you only get wealthy by being a bad person, which, by the way, the more government intervenes in the market, the more that becomes true. In a complete totalitarian economy, you do only become wealthy by doing bad things, by being corrupt. The freer the market, the less true that is. Doesn't mean it can't be true, but it's less true. But I think people underestimate what it takes character-wise to be the type of person who can handle wealth. And not everyone can handle wealth, and some people it destroys. But those who accumulate it over time slowly, and it doesn't destroy, that takes a strength of character that I think should be studied and admired, not just immediately dismissed. Now, if they turn that to evil means and they translate their wealth into power over others and control and manipulation, of course, that's horrible. But that's revealing what's in every human. That's the norm. Humans try to do that stuff. Most just don't have the resources to do it. And those that do it at a bigger level. But people with wealth that don't do that, I think there is so much to learn because the opportunity for evil is so much greater with wealth. And those who don't act on it, and yet they have wealth, I think it takes a lot of humility to admit, if I had as much money as that person, I would probably do worse things than them. And to look at wealthy people who aren't horrible people, they don't have to be saints, but and say, how did they manage to have the strength of character to do that? I think that's something. Anyway, that's an aside. But my overall point is just that about freedom, free markets, and value creation, and your relationship with an employee and things like that. As a Christian, again, it doesn't require you to fire or not fire, to give to charitable organizations or not, to try to make a profit and start businesses or not. You're not required to as a Christian, but you're also not prohibited from. And I think either one of those you can err. If you say you're required to make as much profit as possible and never donate to charities because they destroy value and make the poor dependent and everything, I think that is a kind of, again, it puts the material on too high of a pedestal. It says that material outcomes are all that matter. But I think the opposite, saying, nope, all material success is bad. Ever firing someone because they're not creating enough value is horrible. Making a profit is bad. That's almost material idolatry in the opposite direction. I was going to say it's the opposite. It's the rejection of the material, and Christianity, again, redeems the material. But it's not even a rejection of the material. That would be like a total like asceticism, like I'm going to go live as a hermit and reject this. But you can do that. But if you demand it, I think that's a problem. But the profit is evil. Everyone should, we should force people to be equal. That's material idolatry, but it's almost like an idolatry of the destruction of material. It's like, I am so threatened by material wealth and success that it must all be destroyed because I can't handle it, or I can't handle to see that some people are unequal in whatever they have. So we must destroy it all. It's like this self-hatred, this condemnation of humans thriving, being a part of creation, like humans are called to tend the garden and to, be co-creators, as I mentioned. And to say that they ought to always be destroying value, otherwise it's somehow dirty or evil. I think that's an idolatry it's an idolatry of the negative aspects of material possessions. It's looking at material possessions as dark idols that you can never touch and always casting them aside because they're always dirty and irredeemable. Versus the other, which is looking at them as the holiest thing that you must, worship. And neither of those are true. That's a complex thing in Christianity. The material is not rejected, but it's redeemed. It's not worshipped, but it's brought into alignment with what's right. Subservience to the higher order, not subjugation and, rejection, but redemption. So there's a long ramble. Maybe somebody got something out of it. I certainly did. I enjoyed this. I thought about doing this when it started rolling around in my head last night. And I was like, what's the point? And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do it. So there's that.